When the Audray president tried to evict him, she had no idea she was walking into her own nightmare. Malik Patterson had always dreamed of owning property in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. After years of hard work, he finally made it happen. The house, a stunning two-story brick home in Brentwood Estates, Tennessee, sat on a neatly trimmed lot with a wraparound porch and a spacious backyard. It was exactly what he had envisioned: peaceful, elegant, and the perfect place to settle down. But something felt off from the very first day. Moving boxes still lined the driveway when Malik noticed the eyes peeking from behind curtains, watching from porches, lingering a second too long as neighbors walked their dogs. No one approached, no friendly introductions, no welcome to the neighborhood, just silence. At first, he brushed it off. Maybe people here just kept to themselves. Maybe they'd warm up over time. The first sign that wouldn't happen came the next morning. Malik had barely finished brewing his coffee when he heard a sharp knock at the door. He opened it to find a woman in her mid-60s standing on his porch. She was dressed in a neatly pressed beige blouse, pearl earrings, and a pin with the Audray emblem clipped onto her cardigan. Her posture was rigid, her expression neutral, but there was something in her eyes, something Malik couldn't quite place. "Good morning," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm Thekla Whitman, president of the Brentwood Estates Homeowners Association." Malik extended a hand, offering a polite smile. "Nice to meet you." "I'm sure you are," she interrupted, glancing past him into the house. "I wanted to go over a few things." She handed him a thick stack of printed documents stapled in the corner. Audray guidelines. Malik skimmed the pages, noting the usual rules: lawn maintenance, exterior paint restrictions, approved mailbox designs, standard stuff. But then Thekla cleared her throat. "We like to maintain a certain standard here," she said, her gaze settling on the moving truck still parked in the driveway. "I assume you'll have that removed by this evening?" Malik raised an eyebrow. "It'll be gone once I'm done unpacking." Thekla nodded, but it wasn't a satisfied nod, more like she was making a mental note. "Good," she said. "And just so you're aware, the Audray requires that trash bins be placed at the curb no earlier than 6 a.m. on collection day. I noticed yours were out last night." "I didn't put them out," Malik replied evenly. "The previous owners must have." Thekla pursed her lips. "I see. Well, in the future, please be mindful. We have rules for a reason." And just like that, she turned and walked away. Malik shut the door, exhaling slowly. Maybe she was just particular. A lot of Audray presidents were. He wasn't going to let one uptight neighbor ruin his fresh start. But the next few days made it clear Thekla wasn't just particular, she was watching. A warning notice appeared in his mailbox about an unauthorized vehicle in the driveway, his own car. A second notice came about improper lawn maintenance. His grass had grown an inch, maybe two. Then an Audray violation letter arrived about a porch light that was too bright, despite being the same fixture the previous owner had used. By the end of the week, Malik had collected a neat stack of papers from Thekla. He hadn't spoken to her since their first meeting, but it didn't matter. She had made herself known. Still, he kept his cool. Maybe she was this way with everyone. Maybe he just needed to follow the rules and she'd back off. But that hope faded fast when Malik took an evening walk and passed by a group of neighbors chatting on a nearby driveway. They grew quiet when they saw him. One woman offered a tight smile, but no one else acknowledged his presence. And there, standing in the middle, was Thekla, arms crossed, whispering something to the others. Malik didn't need to hear the words to know this wasn't about Audray rules. It was about him. But if Thekla thought she could intimidate him into leaving, she was in for a surprise. The letters kept coming. Each morning, Malik found a new notice folded neatly in his mailbox, sealed with the Brentwood Estates Audray stamp. At first, he tossed them in a kitchen drawer, skimming them just enough to confirm what he already knew. Thekla Whitman was determined to make his life miserable. But by the time he received the fifth letter in just 2 weeks, Malik had had enough. This time it was about his trash cans. Bins must be retrieved within 1 hour of collection to preserve neighborhood aesthetics, the letter read. Malik stared at the paper, irritation bubbling under his skin. He had picked up his bins the same way his neighbors had, after work, but apparently that wasn't good enough. Curious, he decided to do a little test. The next morning he woke up early and took a slow walk through the neighborhood, paying close attention to the houses. By 9 a.m., dozens of trash bins were still lined up along the curbs. Some weren't even fully closed, lids propped open with overflowing bags. Not a single violation notice on any of them, just his. Malik snapped a few pictures and sent an email to the Audray board, politely asking why his bins were an issue while everyone else's were. No response. 2 days later, Thecla was back on his doorstep. She didn't knock this time, just stood there, waiting, arms crossed, clipboard in hand. Malik opened the door and leaned against the frame. "Something I can help you with?" he asked. Thecla didn't answer right away. She looked over his shoulder, eyes scanning the inside of his home like she was taking inventory. Then she held up a form. "This is a formal request for you to submit proof of home ownership," she said. "We've had complaints." Malik's stomach tightened. "Complaints?" "Neighbors have expressed concerns," Thecla continued, her voice syrupy but sharp. "They've noticed unusual activity, different cars coming and going, furniture deliveries at odd hours. Some are worried you may be renting this property in violation of Audray regulations." Malik let out a short, humorous laugh. "You're kidding." Thecla's face didn't flinch. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "First off, I own this house. Second, I've lived here less than a month. I'm still moving in. That's why there have been deliveries. And as for the cars, those are friends and family visiting." Thecla pressed her lips together, her fingers tightening around her clipboard. "Well, we have policies to ensure all homeowners are properly vetted. We'll need to verify your deed." Malik knew exactly what this was. He hadn't asked any other neighbors for proof of home ownership, just him. Still, he kept his voice level. "You can pull the records yourself, it's public information." Thecla's eyes narrowed slightly, but she quickly recovered, smoothing out her expression. "I'd prefer if you submitted it directly." "And if I don't?" Malik asked, a hint of challenge in his voice. Thecla's lips curled into something that was supposed to be a smile, but there was no warmth behind it. "Then I'll have no choice but to escalate the matter with the Audray board." Malik exhaled slowly, holding back the words sitting on the tip of his tongue. She wanted him to react, to get angry, to raise his voice and give her an excuse to turn him into the problem. So he just smiled. "I'll think about it," he said, then closed the door before she could say another word. Thecla's didn't like that. That evening, as Malik sat on his porch, sipping a beer, he saw her again, standing at the end of his driveway talking to a man in a polo shirt and khakis. She gestured toward Malik's house, speaking in hushed tones. The man nodded, scribbling something down on a notepad. Malik didn't have to guess what was happening. Thecla wasn't just trying to intimidate him anymore. She was looking for a way to get rid of him. But if she thought she could push him out, she was about to learn a hard lesson. The next morning, Malik woke up to an email from the Audray. Subject: Notice of violation. It was about his porch furniture. According to the email, his outdoor seating arrangement, 2 wicker chairs and a small glass table, did not conform to the aesthetic standards outlined in the Audray guidelines. A vague rule, one that clearly wasn't being enforced on anyone else. Malik leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had walked this neighborhood more than enough times to know that at least a dozen homes had similar setups. Some even had old plastic chairs that looked like they had been sitting out since the early 2000s, yet somehow his was the problem. He ignored the notice. A day later, another email arrived. Subject: Second notice. Lawn maintenance violation. Malik frowned. His lawn was freshly cut, edged, and watered. He had spent the entire afternoon trimming the hedges, making sure everything was spotless. But there it was, a formal complaint stating that his grass was slightly overgrown and warning that fines could be issued if the problem wasn't corrected. Malik knew exactly what was happening. Thekla was trying to drown him in complaints, stacking up minor infractions until she had enough leverage to escalate things. So he decided to play her game. That evening, he took a slow walk through the neighborhood, jotting down every single actual violation he saw. Overgrown yards, broken shutters, faded house numbers, trash bins still sitting by the curb from the morning before. Then he submitted his own complaints, each one backed with time-stamped photos. It took less than 24 hours for Thekla to show up again. This time she wasn't alone. She stood at the edge of Malik's driveway with another Audray board member, an older man with salt and pepper hair and a clipboard in hand. Malik recognized him from the Audray website. Stephen Reynolds, Vice President. Thekla's expression was tighter than usual. The forced politeness barely masking her irritation, Thekla greeted Malik. "Mr. Patterson," she said, her voice stretched thin, "we received your list of complaints." Malik crossed his arms, nodding. "Good. Then you know I'm not the only one being held to a ridiculous standard." Stephen cleared his throat, glancing at Thekla before speaking. "We appreciate your concerns, but the Audray board determines which issues require action. Not every minor infraction warrants a formal notice." Malik scoffed. "So mine do, but everyone else's don't?" Thekla didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled out a printed form and handed it to him. "This is your final warning before fines are issued. Your porch furniture needs to be replaced, and your lawn must remain at the regulated length at all times." Malik stared at the paper, then slowly looked up at Thekla. He wasn't stupid. This wasn't about grass or furniture. This was about making him feel like he didn't belong. He took a deep breath, forcing a slow smile. "You know, Thekla, I've read the Audray bylaws from top to bottom. Nowhere does it say a homeowner needs to replace furniture that's in perfect condition." Thekla stiffened. "It's a matter of neighborhood uniformity," she replied, her tone tight. Malik raised an eyebrow. "So, you enforce rules that don't exist?" Thekla's jaw twitched and Stephen shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, Malik saw doubt creeping into Stephen's expression. He wasn't fully convinced. Malik decided to push a little further. "Let me ask you something," he said, keeping his tone even. "If I was someone else, say one of my neighbors, would we even be having this conversation?" Thekla's nostrils flared. Stephen opened his mouth, hesitated, then closed it again. No answer. Malik nodded, folding the paper in half. "That's what I thought." Thekla inhaled sharply, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "If you refuse to comply, the Audray has the authority to take further action." Malik met her gaze unwavering. "Then do what you have to do." Thekla turned on her heel and walked away, her posture stiff with barely contained frustration. Stephen lingered for a second, then followed. Malik watched them go, gripping the violation notice in his hand. He had just called her bluff. But Thekla wasn't the type to back down easily. Malik expected retaliation, but he didn't expect how far she'd take it. The next morning, a thick envelope sat in his mailbox. No Audray logo this time. Instead, it was from a law firm. Inside was an official complaint filed with the Davidson County Housing Authority, accusing him of being a fraudulent occupant. Thekla had gone from petty fines to trying to have him legally removed from his own home. Malik stared at the document, his pulse steady but his hands tightening around the paper. She was really doing this. He read through the complaint. The claims were flimsy, allegations that he had failed to provide proof of homeownership, suspicions that he was renting the property under false pretenses, and a statement that multiple neighbors had expressed concerns about his presence. No names, no actual proof, just assumptions dressed up in legal jargon. For a second, Malik considered ignoring it. The accusations wouldn't hold up. But then he realized this wasn't about getting him evicted. It was about exhausting him. Thekla wanted him buried in legal headaches. She wanted him frustrated, drained, willing to just walk away rather than fight back. But what she didn't know was that she was playing right into his hands. That evening, Malik made a phone call. "Hey, Joe," he said when the line picked up. "I need a favor." Joe Martinez had been Malik's real estate attorney for years, sharp, relentless, and twice as ruthless as Thekla ever hoped to be. By the next morning, Malik had everything he needed, and he wasn't just going to defend himself, he was about to flip the entire situation on its head. 3 days later, the Audray emergency board meeting was packed. Thekla sat at the head of the long conference table, her expression carefully neutral. The other board members flanked her, some looking uncomfortable, others pretending to be busy with their notes. The room buzzed with whispered conversations, homeowners shifting in their seats, glancing between Malik and the board. They had all heard the rumors. They were waiting for a showdown. Thekla cleared her throat, lifting a printed document. "We are here to address the ongoing issue regarding Mr. Patterson's residence. Given the numerous violations and the concerns raised by our community members, I'd like to speak," Malik interrupted, his voice calm but firm. Thekla's lips thinned. "You'll have a chance to respond after." "No," Malik said, setting down a stack of his own papers. "I'm speaking now." A murmur spread through the room. Thekla stiffened but gestured for him to continue. Malik stood, unfolding the first document. "This," he said, holding up the deed to his house, "is the legal proof that I own my home, filed, recorded, and indisputable." A few heads turned. Some of the board members exchanged glances. Malik set the deed down and pulled out another paper. "This," he continued, "is the purchase agreement for another property, 2 and 14 Oakwood Drive." Thekla's face barely changed, but Malik saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes. Then he pulled out the final document. "And this," he said, letting the words hang in the air, "is the deed for 2 and 16 Oakwood Drive. Thekla's house?" The silence that followed was deafening. Malik didn't sit back down. He let the weight of the moment settle, allowing Thekla to process what had just happened. The same woman who had spent weeks trying to have him removed had just found out that her own house belonged to him, and she hadn't even known. Thekla's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Then, in a quiet, tight voice, she asked, "How?" Malik folded his arms. "You might want to check the Audray records, Thekla. That foreclosure you ignored, the property sale that went through last month, I was the buyer." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Thekla's hands clenched around the papers in front of her. Malik tilted his head. "So, tell me, Thekla, who's the real trespasser now?" And just like that, the entire room shifted. It sat in stunned silence. Thekla's face had drained of color. Her perfectly controlled demeanor was cracking at the edges. The power she had wielded over Malik for weeks had just disintegrated in front of everyone. Malik took his time, letting the weight of his words settle. He wasn't done. He picked up another document from his neatly stacked pile. "Now let's talk about fraudulent eviction attempts," he said. Thekla's head snapped up. "Excuse me?" Malik tapped the legal complaint she had filed. "You reported me as an illegal occupant. You claimed I had no right to live in my home." He paused, then looked directly at her. "Would you care to explain why?" Thekla's fingers twitched against the table, but she forced her voice to remain even. "As I stated in my report, several residents expressed concerns." "Who?" Malik interrupted. Thekla's jaw tightened. "I am not at liberty to disclose their names." Malik raised an eyebrow. "That's funny because I spoke to several neighbors before this meeting. No one remembers expressing concerns." A few murmurs stirred in the crowd. Homeowners exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably. The tension in the room shifted. It wasn't just between Malik and Thekla anymore. People were starting to see it. Thekla opened her mouth, but Malik continued before she could recover. "You accused me of violating Audray policies. Yet you've repeatedly ignored other violations in this community. He pulled out a stack of printed emails. I filed formal complaints about broken shutters, overgrown lawns, trash bins left out for days. None of them resulted in violation notices. He turned to the rest of the board. Tell me, do these rules only apply when Thecla feels like enforcing them? Stephen Reynolds, the Audray vice president, cleared his throat. I think we should take a moment to... No, Malik said sharply, his eyes still on Thecla, because this isn't about Audray rules. It never was. This was about her deciding who she thinks belongs here. A sharp murmur rippled through the crowd. Thecla's lips parted, panic flashing across her face for the first time. Malik wasn't just exposing her, he was forcing the entire neighborhood to see what had been happening right in front of them. Thecla let out a shaky breath. Mr. Patterson, I was simply trying to... Intimidate me into leaving? Malik finished for her. Yeah, I got that. Silence. Then a voice from the back of the room broke through. This is a disgrace, an older man muttered. Malik turned to see Mr. Holloway, one of the longest-standing residents of the neighborhood. He shook his head, looking at Thecla. You really tried to evict the man who owns your house? A few scattered chuckles echoed through the room. The shift was happening, but Malik wasn't done yet. He placed his final document on the table. And one more thing, Thecla. You're behind on your Audray fees. Her head snapped up. That's a lie. Malik tapped the paper. I bought your house at auction. Remember that? That includes the debt attached to it. You owe the Audray over $3,000 in unpaid fines and fees. A fresh wave of whispers spread through the board members. Stephen adjusted his glasses, frowning as he read over the document. Thecla, is this true? Thecla's lips parted, but no words came out. She had buried herself. Malik leaned back in his chair. I suggest you start paying up. Wouldn't want to violate any of your own rules, would you? A low chuckle swept through the crowd. Even some of the board members were barely containing their reactions. Thecla's face burned red. She had spent weeks trying to control Malik, and now, in front of the entire Audray, the tables had turned. Her authority had been reduced to nothing. Thecla clenched her jaw, scrambling for a way out. This meeting is adjourned, she snapped, shoving her papers into a folder. We will revisit this matter at a later date. She shot to her feet and marched toward the exit, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. But for the first time, no one followed her. Malik exhaled, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. He had won. But Thecla wasn't the type to walk away without a fight. Thecla stormed out of the Audray meeting, her face tight with barely contained rage. The silence she left behind was thick. No one moved, no one spoke. The board members shifted uncomfortably, as if finally realizing they had hitched themselves to the wrong wagon. Malik didn't move either. He just sat back, watching. Then, slowly, the murmurs began. Can you believe this? Someone whispered. She tried to evict the wrong guy. Another chuckled. Stephen Reynolds, still seated at the table, cleared his throat. Well, he started awkwardly, adjusting his tie. I think it's safe to say this situation was mishandled. Mishandled? Malik let out a short laugh. That was one way to put it. One of the neighbors, Lisa Hendricks, a middle-aged woman who lived 3 houses down, turned to him. I don't know what to say, she admitted. I had no idea she was doing all this. Malik arched an eyebrow. Didn't you? Lisa opened her mouth, but no words came out. A few others looked away, shifting in their seats, because the truth was they did know. They had watched as Thecla issued violation after violation. They had seen how she singled Malik out, and yet, until she embarrassed herself, no one had said a word. The guilt was settling in now. But guilt wasn't an apology, and Malik wasn't interested in empty words. Instead, he turned to Stephen. Since we're still here, let's discuss actual Audray violations. Stephen straightened, uneasy. Like what? Malik picked up his list, the same one Thecla had ignored when he submitted it weeks ago. Broken fences, trash bins left out for days, lawns that haven't been mowed in weeks. All of these violations exist right now, but somehow I was the only one receiving fines. Stephen glanced at the list, then at the other board members. A few of them looked visibly uncomfortable. They knew Malik was right. "We'll review these complaints properly," Stephen said. Malik gave a slow nod. "Good. And while you're at it, I'd like to file a formal complaint against Thekla Whitman for harassment, falsifying Audray complaints, and attempting to misuse her authority for personal grievances." A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Lisa shifted in her seat. "Do we have the authority to do that?" she asked. Stephen let out a slow breath. "The board can vote for removal if an Audray officer is found abusing their position." Malik leaned forward, "Then put it to a vote." Lisa hesitated, then nodded. "Seconded." One by one, hands started going up around the room. Malik watched as the people who had once stood by silently now voted to strip Barbara of her title. It was ironic. If she had just left him alone, she'd still be Audray president. But her own arrogance had been her downfall. A few minutes later, Stephen cleared his throat. "By a majority vote, Barbara Whitman is officially removed as president of the Brentwood Estates Audray, effective immediately." There it was, the final nail in the coffin. Malik stood, slipping his papers into his folder. "Well," he said, turning toward the door, "that was productive." A few chuckles broke the tension, and as he stepped out he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him. They had all learned a lesson that night, but the person who needed it most was still in denial. Barbara Whitman wasn't done yet. Barbara Whitman didn't take defeat lightly. The morning after her public humiliation at the Audray meeting, Malik spotted her standing at the edge of his driveway. She wasn't alone this time. Her husband Richard, a man in his early 70s with a stiff posture and a scowl, stood beside her. Malik stepped onto his porch, arms crossed. "Something I can help you with?" Barbara's voice was tight, controlled. "I want to discuss the sale of my home." Malik had expected this. After all, the thought of renting from him must have been unbearable for her. "I'm not selling," he said simply. Barbara's jaw clenched. "I've lived in that house for 32 years. Malik tilted his head. "And yet you never paid off the debt attached to it." Richard cleared his throat. "We're prepared to offer you a fair price." Malik leaned against the railing. "Define fair." Barbara huffed, her patience wearing thin. "The same amount you paid at auction." Malik let out a short laugh. "That's not how real estate works. You lost your house because of unpaid fees. I legally purchased it. If you want it back, you'll have to buy it at market value." Barbara's hands balled into fists. "That's ridiculous. You're just trying to make a profit off of me." Malik's expression hardened. "No, Barbara. I'm treating you exactly how you treated me." Silence stretched between them. For weeks she had weaponized rules and regulations against him, convinced she held all the power. Now she was the one at someone else's mercy. Richard sighed. "How much?" Malik glanced toward the house. "Given the location, the current market, and your unpaid fees, $450,000? Barbara's face twisted. "That's outrageous." Malik shrugged. "Then I guess you'll have to find somewhere else to live." For the first time, true panic flickered across her face. This was real now. She wasn't just being removed from the Audray board. She was losing the home she had lived in for 3 decades. Richard sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "We'll consider it." Malik nodded. "Take your time." As they turned to leave, Barbara hesitated. She looked back at him, something different in her expression. Not quite remorse, but the realization that she had never actually been in control. For weeks, she had been so focused on pushing him out that she hadn't seen the real danger. Her own actions had cost her everything. Malik let the moment sit before speaking. "Barbara," he said. She turned stiffly. "Next time you judge someone before knowing them," He gestured toward her house. "Remember where it got you." She didn't say a word, just turned and walked away. A month later, the "For Sale" sign went up in front of 216 Oakwood Drive. Barbara had refused to buy back the house at Malik's price, and no bank would give her a loan for the amount she needed. She and Richard packed up and left in the middle of the night, moving to a smaller place across town. The neighborhood changed after that. Without Barbara in charge, the Audray actually started working the way it was supposed to, addressing real issues instead of policing nonsense. And the neighbors, some still avoiding eye contact, embarrassed by their silence, but others made an effort, slowly breaking the wall they had helped Barbara build. One day, Lisa Hendricks, one of the few who had voted against Barbara, walked up Malik's driveway with a plate of cookies. "I know it's late," she said, shifting awkwardly, "but welcome to the neighborhood." Malik smiled, accepting the plate. "Took you long enough?" Lisa chuckled, a little sheepish. "Yeah, it did." Malik took a bite of a cookie, sweet, a little stale, but better late than never. Some people spend their lives trying to control others. They think their power comes from rules, from status, from making others feel small. But real power comes from knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone take that away from you. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more, because trust me, there's plenty more where this came from.